Good evening. This is the weekly talk show organized by the CSO Platform for Reforms. I'm Chung, today's moderator. At these weekly talk shows, we cover contemporary issues that impact society at large. And today's topic is Stop Violence Against Children, a reflection and action post-MCO. UNICEF says children are at heightened risk of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence amidst intensifying containment measures to combat COVID-19. With us to discuss this are two individuals. First, Kareeshini Priyadev, a child rights activist. And second, Associate Professor Dr. GESHINA. She's a criminologist and psychologist at the Forensic Science Program at the University of Science, Malaysia. Welcome, Kareeshini and Dr. GESHINA. So let's begin, Kareeshini. Maybe we'll start. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in child rights? Kareeshini, we'll start with you.
Oh, actually, basically, I was involved in this, and I'm trying in my little way to create an awareness to everyone, to give their rights to them, to make them aware of their own rights.
And you're currently in Form 3,
Form
is that
3.
right?
Yeah, Form 3.
And I think you were telling me earlier that you got involved in child rights, I think through some of your own observations, but also you went to a workshop where you were exposed a little bit to some of these. Maybe you can tell us about that workshop.
Oh, actually, I was one of I took part in lots of workshops. Like one of them was I was one of the two representatives for the consultation session, which was conducted by Suhakam and the Department of Social Welfare. Besides that, I've also taken part in Girls' Rights, My Right with WAO, and I've also taken part in a program in Childline Foundation.
That's great. So it looks like you really got quite a lot of exposure and experience.
Yeah.
For some your age, being to workshops not only by institutions but also government and as well as NGOs. So that's great. It was glad to have you with us today. So Dr. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in child rights work? I think Dr. GESHINA might be having a little bit of technical issues. So she'll join us right after this, but it's okay. We'll continue our conversation with Kareeshini, and Dr. GESHINA will join us when she can. So to the viewers out there, thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions along the way, just add them in the comment section below. And so we'll try and address all the questions that you ask along the way. So Kareeshini, tell us a bit about, when we talk about violence against children, what does that mean to you?
It's basically like an act of violence towards a child as defined by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in Article 19. Some of the examples are physical, emotional, sexual, and also child and online abuse.
That's a really good definition. We have Dr. GESHINA has come back. So Dr. GESHINA, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in child rights?
Right, okay. So I've been involved in this area since the year 2000. That was soon after I did my second master's, which was in master's in applied criminology. And then I went on to do my PhD in criminology. So since the year 2000, about 20 years now. Wow, okay, that's a long time. So I've been involved in this area from the perspective of the criminals themselves, who had sexually abused children, mostly those who had physically abused them, I've also had some contact and not only research but also counseling with children victims of violence. So that's basically my background where I come into this issue. I've been involved with Kementerian Dalam Negeri, Ministry of Women as well, schools, universities, of course, dealing with victims of violence.
Thanks, Dr. Kashina. And those who are familiar with Dr. Kashina's work will know that she's one of the consultants or the advisors that the government is always calling upon for various issues relating to children and women. So we're really happy to have you here with us. So we were talking a little bit about the definition of violence against children. Kareeshini has given us a nice overview from the Convention on Rights of the Child. Dr. GESHINA, would you like to add what does violence against children mean?
Okay, so Jeremy, can you share the slide, please? Is the slides up? Okay, so next slide, please. So basically, when we look into the issue of violence, this is the latest report that I had obtained September 2019. There are, I'm sure there are more now, but at that time there were 45 million images of child sexual abuse online, and that is just for child sexual abuse. When we deal with how we define what is violence against children, the next slide, please. Jeremy? Okay, this one. So this one, yes, this is the right slide. There's different ways of looking at what we mean by violence against children. The most obvious way is using what laws are available. In today's context, we look at it into either the national laws, and there are several there, and I heard that Kareeshini had shared some of these laws. And the other aspect is using global or international conventions, which Kareeshini had also shared. Moving to the next slide. Not this slide, the one before, please. You had skipped one. After this.
We might have lost Dr. GESHINA again, but it's okay. I think she's nicely given her slides here, and we'll come back to her when she gets back on. Oh, there she is. Okay, Dr. GESHINA, would you like to continue? Well, let's move on to the next question, and then we can come back to this.
Okay, I'm come back now.
There you go.
Now it's gone. Okay.
Great.
It's the area where I am. So, okay, basically, when we refer to the Child Act, it looks into 4 forms of violence, which is ill treatment, neglect, abandonment, or exposure of children, as well as sexual abuse. But having said that, WHO in 2020 looks into it, violence into a bigger scope, that is all forms of violence, and it can be perpetrated by anyone. It's not just family members, it's not just the caretaker of the child. So it's a wider context.
Great. Thanks,
So,
Dr.
if we look from the WHO, the forms of violence that is talked about is maltreatment, is bullying, intimate partner violence, youth violence, sexual violence, emotional and psychological violence. Many people think that it is only when they witness children being abused that they should make a report. However, this is not true, because Malaysian law specifically says that it is a duty of every adult to actually make a report if they see, if they hear, if they know of violence against children. So this is actually addressed in Section 27A of the Child Act 2001. First, it specifies that it's a medical officer or medical practitioner has a duty to report. Then the next section, Section 28 and 29, is any family member, any childcare provider, which involves schools, counselors, any person of authority that deal with children, have a duty to make a report if there's incidents of violence, if they know about it, if they suspect a case of violence, and if they do not do so, then that person is liable for a fine, which can lead to, I think it's 50,000, it's not 5,000, or imprisonment, okay, of a term not exceeding 2 years. So you can be fined for it, and you can be put into prison, or both, if you fail to report. So maybe someone hears a neighbor being abused, a neighbor's child being abused. That person has a duty to report. There's been so many instances that we've come across in the media. Suddenly a child dies, and then the neighbor comes up and says, "Oh, I had no idea that it was so bad. I do hear the child crying at night. I know the child screams, but I did not know it was so bad." Suddenly a body bag exits the house. Well, it's a bit too late then. So if someone makes a report against that neighbor can be fined. If a teacher knows of violence or abuse that happens in schools and is afraid, or 101 reasons given by the teacher or the counselor not to make a report, and suddenly that child goes to hospital and finds himself or herself having permanent disability. So it is through neglect. If someone makes a report, that teacher or counselor can be fined, can be brought to justice.
Thanks, Dr. GESHINA. So I think we saw there the child abuse is a wide range of forms of child abuse, physical, of course, but also sexual, psychological, and neglect. And I think a very important point that Dr. GESHINA raised was the duty to report. So if we suspect child abuse against children, we should report, and some people are duty bound by the law to report.
Yes.
I think you mentioned officer, family members, and child care providers. And in the case of sexual abuse, anyone who suspects sexual abuse must report to the police or welfare. So that's a really important point. Thank you so much, Dr. GESHINA. Let's talk a little bit about, so when you talk about physical abuse, is caning physical abuse? Kareeshini, maybe get some of your thoughts on this.
So basically, it's like it affects the child in their, like, the confidence will go and all that. Like, they'll feel like left out. No one wants them. So because they're yeah. So can I give you an example?
Yeah.
Okay. So for example, when my brother was a kid in school, he was trashed and beaten severely by his teacher, and also had his sideburns pulled, and every day in his primary school. And this impacted me like greatly, that I decided to do something about it when I grow up.
So Kareeshini, thank you so much for sharing that story of your brother, and it's something that motivated you. But I think you've also raised a very crucial point here, which is abuse and violence that happens in schools.
Yeah, exactly.
Be it you described pulling the sideburns, even caning. So what are your thoughts, Dr. GESHINA, on this issue of caning, and does that amount to violence against children?
Right. In schools, there are actually several laws pertaining to disciplinary action that are permissive. The law clearly states when it comes to children, female gender, you can't cane them. You're not allowed to. And there are specific teachers who can actually administer the punishment. But when it comes to male children, again, there are specific cases, specific conditions in which some forms of punishment are warranted. It is not whereby a simple misbehavior and just take the cane and just wall up the boy. No, that's totally unacceptable. That's totally wrong. So there are disciplinary laws, especially governed for schools, especially used in, for example, boarding schools as well, in childcare centers, for example, in orphanages. There are laws in place. So the problem comes when the teachers, some of the counselors perhaps, who are unaware of those laws, who forget those laws, and take their own take the law into their own hands, basically. Children are not allowed to abuse other children, not allowed to bully them. It is a duty of teachers to make the report. There are guidelines, there's SOP in place. And this is one of the reasons why there was a recent case, I think a few weeks back, whereby a family actually won a case. A boy was actually abused in school so bad that he had permanent damage, and they won the case, and the teachers and the school has to pay a couple of million to the family because of that. So it's caning. There are laws and regulations for it. It's not a simple matter of just any type of wrongdoing the child does. Misbehavior becomes ingredients. This is this is where teachers, family members, they have to meet a very clear line of what is justifiable for what type of punishment. Other than caning, there are other ways to teach a child good values. For example, community service. Okay, helping to clean up the neighborhood, painting over the graffiti, picking up rubbish, for example. So that teaches them responsibility. Some people would perhaps advocate caning because the child seems to be too degil, too rude, too much misbehavior. Again, that's not warranted. So to me personally, I don't agree with caning. There are other forms of punishment that does not cause lasting harm. Some netizens believed that I was caned when I was young. I'm an okay adult. Is it true? Because when children experience caning in school life, how are they going to treat their children now? Are these adults who have been caned in schools, perhaps even worse by their own parents when they were young, now they're grown up, they have their own kids, are they doing the same thing to their own children? So it's a vicious cycle of violence. It should not be allowed, it should stop, and it begins with you.
That's a really great point. So I think, Dr. GESHINA, I think that's the message out there for those of you listening. You might, if you're a student or you're a parent, corporal punishment, caning, there are specific standards and laws, so you cannot simply be caned, or you cannot simply cane a child.
Yeah, that's right. You just cannot simply do that.
Yeah, and I think a great point that you raised, GESHINA, was should we in fact even allow any kind of that kind of physical punishment? I believe even if we look at international standards under Convention of Child Rights, there's a definition given in one of the general comments that defines corporal punishment as anything, however light. They use the term however light. So even a very light form of caning would not be in line with international standards. Do you want to add?
I would just like to add also, sometimes people who actually do the caning, they don't take into consideration that the person that they are punishing is a child. So what happens is that they take the cane and wallop with all the heart and desire and frustration and anger. Now that's wrong. Because the amount of power that an adult uses behind the caning is way beyond the power, the energy, what the child can actually handle.
That's true.
Even when we go in prison, okay, even in prison when there's a punishment, caning for wrongdoing, especially for example rapists, it is not any person who's a warden who can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Wardens are specially trained to use the cane. Okay, the rotan has to have specific circumference. Okay, there's a specific weight to it. There's a specific length to it. There's a specific way to hit. Okay, and actually, when you hear it, when the whipping goes, oh.
And so just to clarify, Dr. GESHINA, you're talking about caning as a punishment for adult offenders.
Adult offenders, yes. So what I'm saying here is that even adult offenders, you have specific guidelines. What can, what cannot be done. What more a child? So there are also laws in place, regulations in place that must be adhered to, because there will be a fine line between discipline and outright physical violence.
Thanks, Dr. GESHINA. Kareeshini, do you have anything to add on? What are your thoughts on caning or the kind of physical punishments in school? Should any of it be allowed? What do you think?
No, I don't think it should be allowed because in my primary school, it's like my teachers just used to pinch me, and sometimes like they used to make like, if I don't do my homework, they just ask us to stand outside, and when we just sweat it out like in the like dying hot sun. It's really hot, so like we have to suffer that. Just it's still not okay, but like the pinching, talking about the pinching, that is unnecessary. That was
Yeah,
unnecessary.
I agree. It's unnecessary. That is,
Exactly.
it's not necessary because the pain of the pinch, it will be
Yeah, it was
physically.
kind of, yeah, it's
It's
really painful.
children don't actually understand the logic behind it. Why pinch? I didn't do
Yeah,
something that harmful that I need to be pinched. But you see,
exactly.
the pain is there. However, you have bruising, you have scars that are long lasting. It does not
That's
help to remind the child to behave. What it actually teaches the child, do, but don't get caught.
So,
So that's
so why is it so important for us to try and fight violence against children? I mean, what are some of the impacts? I think we started going into that conversation a little bit. So, of course, there's the immediate impact, and then there's the longer term impact, perhaps. So maybe we can hear some of your thoughts on Kareeshini, on what you started getting into it a little bit already, but what are the impacts of violence against children?
like actually like basically like the kid, like the child would feel um like they won't have self confidence as much as the other kids do, because in front of the whole class the teacher just like beat them up. So the child feels like it they don't have they don't like have anyone that support them. No one helps them and all that,
Hmm.
so they feel left out in everything they do.
It adds to a sense of isolation.
Exactly.
And I think in some of the stories you mentioned earlier, some of those elements of how a child feels, I think, came out. You described your story, and then you described the story of your brother. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Dr. Geshina, what are the impacts of violence against children?
there are actually quite a lot of impacts.
We'll get back to Dr. Geshina when she comes back. So, Kareeshini, uh, why why are children abused or victimized?
Oh, actually, it's because I feel that children are victims and victims and easy prey to abuse for the simple reason that they are helpless, they are vulnerable, and they are sitting ducks for attack. So, for example, if I was abused at home by my own parents, what can I do? Like, who can I approach? And I could easily be intimidated by my parents, so I would be afraid to go to the police. To top it to top it off, I went to the police. I risked getting abuse from the policeman as well. So child abuse is a societal problem. Everyone in the society, not only the child's parents or relatives, but the police, the school teachers, and the government plays an important role in making sure all children are safe and all children live in a secure community.
Thanks, Kirsty. I think that's a really good point. I think you really highlighted there how in various spheres at home with your parents or at school with your teachers or even when dealing with other authorities like police, children are oftentimes in less empowered situations. And you
Exactly. Yeah.
why you highlighted why it's so important then for all these different structures to be extra cognizant of this power dynamics. So thanks so much for that. Dr. Kishina, we have you back.
All right,
Uh,
yes.
you were going into the
How
impact.
violence affects.
the violence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Okay, so there's basically
there's
three levels.
basically 3 levels.
We have the short term. Jeremy, can you share the slides, please? So when we look into the lifelong impacts, it not only happens to the children, it also impacts the families, the communities and nations, because these abused children will later be our leaders. So how it affects, we have various levels. We have from biology. It looks into, for example, brain, nervous system development. For example, it can also be whereby the development of the child psychologically, the growth of the child, how are the children going to behave as adults? Are they going to have healthy, normal relationship with other people, or are they going to be violent, abusive as adult behavior? The other impact we're looking into is the physical well-being. Some people have been so abused when they're children. They have lost their sight, they have lost their hearing, they have become partially, unable to perform like they normally did. Psychologically, some people develop psychosis, some become crazy, some develop distrust of the same gender or different gender. They don't want to become mothers, they don't want to become fathers, they have fears, they have phobias, and this later in turn to the social economy. Some children who have been so damaged by the abuse that they've gone through, they can't become functioning, contributive members of society when they grow older. They may fear to work with other people when they grow up because they are afraid of being abused. They are afraid of becoming victims of workplace violence, for example. So when that is all taken into consideration, we can see that most of the time, if a child has been abused when they're young, this will carry through all the way to adult life. And this does not even count for situations whereby such children, because they've been victims before, they continue the cycle of victimization with their children or even other children. So it's very dangerous, and it's a fallacy, in fact, or even a denial on the hand of abusers who think that hitting, abusing children, neglecting children is all right. They are resilient. When they grow up, they will become normal. Actually, no. There's a lot of studies available that indicate a level of abuse that the child experiences will continue to have negative impact on children when they grow.
Thanks, Dr. Kareeshini. We were also getting into the question of why do we see violence against children, child abuse? Dr. Kareeshini?
Sorry, because sometimes the line is not that good, so I didn't actually hear what you were saying just now.
The question was, why do we see child abuse happening?
Oh, all right, okay. So, hold on. Okay, so the thing is, when we deal with children as victims, we need to look into the main thing is the abuser. The abuser actually has 3 pathways of why they abuse. The first, we look into the abuser's own self, then we look into the cultural norm, and the third is a cognitive distortion. So on the abuser's side, it can be isolation or lack of support. They don't get, there's no one in the immediate environment to help them raise the children, for example. They don't have a good relationship with others, and they lash out their frustration on the child. So isolating themselves from other people, sometimes the abuse goes on and on and on, and no one knows about the actual abuse that goes on. Second is stress. Sometimes the abuser is very stressful at the work environment with a life situation, and they just lash out against children. Third is unrealistic expectations. Among the things would be, for example, a lack of understanding of what children can do or ought to do. There is this expected, the unrealistic expectation would be, for example, expecting a child to take care of a sick parent when they themselves, the children, have no training, have no knowledge on how to do that. Aside the child to become pregnant, for example. So the child is unable to bring in the money, and the child gets abused. Sometimes a big issue is lack of parenting skills, so the child gets abused. There's also drug and alcohol problems. This is very, very pertinent in the situation in Malaysia. Many children who have drug addicts or alcoholic parents would find themselves becoming victims of violence at home. The abuser may have low self-esteem and self-confidence, and a way to boost up this, to have a feeling of power, to have a feeling of control, they will abuse children under their care because the children are unlikely to fight back. And lastly is poor childhood experiences. So yes, there are a lot of studies to support this. If a person has been abused in their youth, they're likely to abuse others when they grow up. Second aspect of why children are abused, we look into the culture or norm, whereby the home environment is abusive to begin with. So this is a vicious cycle from the grandparents' time. The grandparents had abused their own children, so those children grow up to become parents themselves, and the abuse goes on and on. Sometimes it's also about high tolerance of violence in the neighborhood or society. The whole society there is violent to begin with. It is a masculine society where you're supposed to keep quiet when you're being abused. It's a way of life for them, for example. And the third aspect of cultural norm is attitude. Attitude is a big issue when it deals with children who are abused and the culture of abusing children. When we talk about attitude, we're looking into the acceptance of the use of violence and force as a way to discipline children, as a way of physical punishment, for example. Acceptance of adults as owners of children. So whatever the adults do to their children is their business. I don't want to get involved. It can be also a matter of racism, whereby you have mixed families, mother from one race, father from another race. The child of such mixed parentage becomes a victim. So they think that it's okay to abuse, to be violent against these children. Another aspect is inequality, the concept of inequality between men and women. Women are treated differently in families. Men are treated differently. So this is kind of typical, whereby the female is only one person in the family. There's only one female child. There are 5 other siblings in the family, but they're all men, are all boys. So it comes to her to hold responsibility of everything for her male siblings, for example. The same can be said if it's only one male child and the rest are female children. So a lot of responsibility is given to this male child beyond his capability to handle it. Because the parents have failed to recognize, failed to accept that they are children. They should not be holding such responsibility as per adults. Sometimes there's also lack of community understanding about the consequences of harm experienced by the children. We see this a lot among sexually abused children. So we get young adults who try to be close to younger children, and they begin sexually grooming them. They take opportunity to get to know their peers or even younger people and start to sexually groom them. And it perpetuates a belief that, no, they're just friends, they're not doing everything. They're just children. What do they know about sexual violence? What do they know about sexual intimacy? So it is attitudes as well as perception that governments, whether or not a child is likely to be abused and whether or not it will continue to be abused. In many instances, neighbors would just ignore what's going on in family matters. It's the family business. I don't want to get involved. It can be a situation whereby that neighbor is afraid of the father figure. The father is well known to be hot-tempered, is well known to be physically abusive, as well as verbally abusive. And I don't want to become a victim of his violence. Let his children be the victim of his violence, for example.
GESHINA, so just to interrupt, sorry to interrupt you there. We have a question from the audience. I think maybe one highlight from I just want to stress one very important point from Dr. GESHINA's slides was that all those reasons, none of them are on the child. So if you're someone out there and you're being abused, correct, or if you know being abused, it's not your fault. Nothing you did.
Correct. Yes. Yes, right. You're right.
So if you just
violence, neglect is not the child's fault. Absolutely. Children should never be blamed for the abuse or violence.
Absolutely.
Okay, because violent behavior is only purposive. It's never accidental. Oops, hit you too much. No, it's always purposive in nature. Right. And it's always about power, it's about control. So the third aspect is cognitive distortion. So many abusers, they justify their behavior. There are actually 12, but I just list some that is more pertinent here. Some adult abusers would say, oh, the child deserves it. I'm doing this to educate my child so they don't do it again. For example, the case that happened in Sweden or in Switzerland, whereby the parents were called and were sent to jail for hitting the children with hanger, for example. Sometimes parents say, it's my right to do so, this is my child. I can hit her, I can even do whatever I want to her or him. They see the child as a scapegoat, a victim blaming. Also, it's part of the cognitive distortion that some abusers have to justify their own actions.
If you're just joining us, we're here with two guests, Kareeshini Priyadev, she's a child rights advocate, and Dr. GESHINA, she's a criminologist and psychologist at University of Science Malaysia. We have two questions here for our guests. The first question is for Kareeshini. It says, if you have the superpower, if you had a superpower to protect children, what superpower would you want to have and why?
I actually don't want any superpower. I think that the 112th member of parliament should support me in what, in changes we make.
So that's a really good point. What would those be? If you could just name one change, maybe we'll get into it later also, but if you could just name one particular change that you want those members of parliament.
I want them to like realize that children are not just something that you not something that you has to obey someone. You have, like, children are basically like human beings. We all are human beings. We have equal rights too. So I want them to know that we have the rights to everything. Like, like basically everything. Because some of the people think that we are just someone, something, like they just assume that we're something that doesn't need to be listened to. So we all need our rights,
So the superpower would be to make lawmakers change that and how they view children. Children are human beings, just like adults.
Exactly.
So let's get into building on that superpower and what you can do. Let's go back to the reality. And so if a child is being abused, what can they do? Where can they go to get help? We'll start with Kareeshini, and then we'll go to Dr. GESHINA.
Could you repeat the question, please?
It
was cutting.
Being abused, if someone is being abused, where can a child go to get help?
Basically, actually, the child can go to their parents or other adults they trust and ask them for help. Even though sometimes it may seem that many adults are getting away with abusing them, there are still organizations that fight to protect children and that you call for help. A few are Women's Aid Organization, Women's Center of Change, Talian Kasih, Cyber 99, and the Befrienders.
Thanks, Kareeshini. Dr. GESHINA, where can children go to get support if they're being abused? I think we're having a bit of technical...
Okay, now I can hear. Okay, so I'm using my handphone as well. All right, okay, so you were saying about where can they go. I think Kareeshini had already said quite a few of the information. Of course, first thing is to tell an adult about it. If Jeremy can show the slide about that, I think it will be the next slide. Okay, so first of all, the one just now, Jeremy, just now, the previous slide. Okay, so tell an adult right away. So that was what Kareeshini also mentioned about, and she also said several of the ways to do so. There's also websites that you can reach out for if you are afraid to be overheard by an adult. Other than that, if it's not you but someone else, so you can be part of being responsible by helping this person, your friend perhaps, your schoolmate or your classmate, and tell a parent or another adult who you think can work towards getting justice for this person. Okay, so the next slide, please, Jeremy. Another thing to take into consideration is sometimes children may not be sure that, am I actually a victim of abuse? Okay, so before they decide to tell someone what is happening, they need to first identify what type of abuse am I actually experiencing. It can be more than one. It can be, for example, physical abuse. So physical abuse when the person, the child, is hit. It can be by hand. It can be by an object. It can be shaking. It can be pushing. It can be even, of course, sexual abuse when another person touches you in a way which is improper. Verbal or emotional abuse, putting you down. That's a lot of bullying. It can be physical neglect. For example, you don't have enough clothes in the sense whereby you can't go to school with the school uniform. Your school shoes don't have soles on it, for example. So things like that. So what can a child actually do? You can talk to a trusted adult in person. Okay, go and see someone. It can be a teacher that's close to you, and not necessarily the counselor. If you feel that it's going to be uncomfortable for you, you can do it on the phone. You can write a note, an email, send a letter to a trusted adult. You don't even have to speak to the person if you're so afraid. Just write a small note. When the teacher is free, teacher, please read this, and then you don't have to be there, for example. So tell someone at school. It can be even a school nurse. When you go to the clinic, tell a friend's mom or dad, or your big sister or big brother. Tell someone on the hotline. Children need to be aware that it takes a lot of courage. Children might be afraid, might feel that they are betraying the family trust, but put that all aside. It is your life that is in danger. That trumps family loyalty, that trumps family fear of reprisal. Because your life, you're going to live it for the rest of how many years that you have left, 50, 60, 70 years. And the impact of the violence that a child experiences may be lifelong. So it's okay to talk to an adult. It is not your fault. You do not deserve to be abused or become a victim of violence. Do something about it. Make sure that you talk to someone who you can talk to. Okay, not just anyone. Friends will talk to one another. This person can be trusted. This person cannot be trusted. So you can do it in that way. It's a very brave thing to do. If you need someone with you, you can ask your friend to accompany you as well. Okay, so there's other things. I noticed in the chat, Ren, I noticed in the chat there are quite a number of questions actually. So I don't know whether you want to address those.
I think it's okay. The one question has already been addressed.
It says here by Dear Shia, level abuse during children will continue to give negative impact when they grow. So I may know what is a negative impact. Yeah, I think I kind of answered this already because it can be either short-term, long-term, or lifelong.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, I think just to wrap up this question on what children can do, as I think most of you highlighted, there are numerous avenues. It's trusted adult, NGOs. You can call the welfare department at 15999. I think one good phrase that I've heard that child rights groups have advised also is if something is happening to you at this very particular moment, the 3 steps is shout, run, and tell. So if someone is abusing you at school or at home, shout, scream, that will draw attention to the situation and maybe shock or scare the abuser. Then run away. It's the safest way to avoid abuse. Run, and then tell. Tell is that part where it comes in. Tell a trusted adult, or tell the police, or tell a welfare, or a teacher, or someone else. So yeah, there's a question here. It says here, if children are refused to secure identity documents, is this included as child abuse against children? So I guess I'm not entirely sure, but I think if I'm reading it correctly, the question is about, say, if a child is not given their IC, for example, the parents hold their IC, is that child abuse?
Okay, that is not specifically child abuse, it's child neglect. Okay, but it very much depends on the context of the refusal. If the child is known to keep on losing things, so what the parent can do is make photocopy. Let the child keep photocopy of their own my card, my kit, the IC, yeah? And then the adult can keep the original copy. Children sometimes do have a habit of misplacing things, so that can happen. But by the time a child is 14 or 15 years old, yeah, they can keep it. If the child believes that withholding the my card or my IC is a form of abuse, the child can make a report. No one can stop you to make a report. Anyone can make a police report. Okay, even a child. But withholding the IC is not specifically abuse, because there's no, in the terms of our law, it's not physical abuse. It can be a form of neglect. Okay, but not specifically physical abuse as by the law. It can be neglect. It can be emotional abuse in the form of controlling or having power over the child. But again, it's not a very straightforward matter. You have to look at the context. You have to look into the situation.
Thanks, Dr. Kareeshini. Kareeshini, would you like to add anything to this particular question?
I'd like to messages. Okay, so first, stop beating children in school. Okay, you're not teaching us to think. You're teaching us to obey without thought, which is unhealthy. Children should not be physically abused, but they might be helped in a supportive way. Secondly, all politicians who abuse children should resign immediately, because the government plays an important role to help the children be safe and protected, and they must do their duties in a responsible manner. So just imagine they are the head and they are keep leading us, and if they themselves are wrong, what would happen to us? Like, violence in school must first stop.
Thanks, Kareeshini. So I think this is a very strong message to authorities. I think one message was directed at schools. I think another message was directed at lawmakers. So lawmakers need to, I guess, walk the talk and ensure that they themselves are clean from abusing others. Thanks so much, Kareeshini. Dr. GESHINA, I guess the question would be, what would your message be to lawmakers?
Okay, so Jeremy, can you share, I think it's the last slide or the second last slide. Basically, if we were to follow the conventional rights of children, we need more children inclusion and government decision making. One of the issues at hand would be, for example, when schools reopen, will children actually invited to give their input on whether or not it's a good idea to have the schools open without them actually understanding the concept behind social distancing, without them understanding the real need of why they have to wear masks, why they can't be close to their friends, for example. So we need more children inclusion. I'm not saying to ask a 6-year-old or 5-year-old, no, but more mature children like Kareeshini's age, I'm sure they can provide a lot of insight to issues that actually concern them. School inclusion, for example, school hours, for example. So that will make them have a voice, let their voices be heard in society, in decision making, which is, after all, they're part of. So message to policy makers, violence against children is actually a very complex problem, and it is at the individual, the relationship, community, and societal levels. So if we look into the suggestions made by WHO, our efforts to reduce violence against children should be more proactive. At the moment, what we have is mostly reactive. Violence occurs, police report is made, investigation is done, victim blaming, pointing fingers, what needs to be done to now make the child safe. Well, it's a bit too late. The child has already suffered the harm. So efforts should actually be more proactive by following this word, which is inspire. So I means implementation and enforcement of laws. We have laws, but some laws are more enforced than other laws. 2, norms and values change. This means we have to address the grassroots of the problem. We're looking into family environment. Okay, the norms whereby children should be disciplined harshly. Now we should get rid of this. So we need a change in how parents view children, and how parents engage children, and how parents treat children. We have to provide safe environments. It's not only in the homes. We're talking about schools. We're talking about public places. Children should not be afraid of playing in their, for example, playground. They should not be afraid to walk from A to Z, from their house to the nearest, for example, kedai runcit. They shouldn't be afraid to do that. Okay. Parental and caregiver support is another issue. Some parents need parenting skills. Okay, because the only way they know how to treat their children is through violence. We need also caregiver support. Sometimes because of the stress that they face in the caregiving environment, there's only 3, there's only 4 of them, but they have 50 children to take care of. So they need support. When they have that support, psychological support, then it will be less likely for them to become violent or abusive towards children under their care. The next aspect, which is another I, which is income and economic strengthening. So when people have sufficient income to survive, okay, not luxury items, not luxury goods, but to survive, then it is less likely that they're going to vent out their frustrations on people, meaning children, who can fight back. So we need to strengthen people's incomes and economic situation. We also must have response services provision that is actually working. One-stop crisis centers does help, but there's a lot of things that we need to do. For example, we don't have enough social workers. We don't have enough pediatricians. Okay, we don't have enough child psychologists or child psychologists for that matter. Education and life skills is also one of the most important things that we need to make use of to enforce the idea that children are not punching bags, they are human beings, they have rights, and to prepare them for life as as people in the environment, people who should be respected, people who have their desires and they have their own needs, they have their own ways of doing things. So they should not be treated as a toy. They should not be treated as just an extension of a person. So education and life skills is important not only for the child, for members of society, for parents, even teachers can benefit from retraining. Counselors need to update the information and skills also when it comes to education and life skills. So my message to policymakers is quite comprehensive actually, and I continue to work closely with them, but it is a long process because there are some obstacles and different people have different viewpoints on what are the priorities, but that's to be expected. I will continue to work together with them. But when we address the issue of violence against children, you cannot be blaming you cannot be blaming people, blaming different parties, different organizations. You have to look at it holistically. So it goes back to individual, relationship, community, and society levels.
Thanks, Dr. GESHINA and Kareeshini. There's a question here. It says, if teachers neglect bullying in their school, can they be held accountable? So maybe we can rephrase this slightly to talk about if there's bullying in school, what's the teacher's role? Kareeshini, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah. Actually, the teachers should like immediately, because actually the teachers should take action on it, because some teachers it's always happening. So every school, so like in my school, for example, like there was this girl that just got bullied in my class. Like she got bullied and in front of the teacher. The teacher she was just using a phone, And so she didn't notice anything, but it was verbally abuse, not physically. But they were saying all sorts of names to that girl, and like that girl felt like really scared, and she wanted to talk to the teacher, but they don't feel like telling the teacher because the teacher's not interested themselves. Teachers are not interested themselves. So how are they gonna go and explain to the teacher and tell them how to solve the problem? Like teachers teachers basically should like be supportive to the students, and they're not playing their roles. So like also there's an incident that happened, like my sister, she got, like, this was in primary school. She actually went to the toilet with supposedly my friend. So she went there, and that girl just slapped her. I didn't know that, but the sound could be heard. I could hear it, but I didn't know it was my sister getting slapped. But the sound could be slapped. The teacher was just sitting down there. She didn't even bother to check what the sound is. She's just sitting and using her phone. So like one of my classmates, she went to check the sound, and she saw that my sister got slapped on the face. Like she just saw that. And like she told the teacher, the teacher didn't do anything. She just said, "Oh, okay, I'll just report to the principal," and that's all. That's all she said. She didn't really do any action on that.
I think thanks so much for sharing that story, Kareeshini. I think the message is very strong. Teachers ought to intervene in some way if they witness abuse. So we have a couple of questions here. So I think we can take one more question before we end. So the question about child marriage.
Okay.
So what is your take? So there are two questions. So I'll summarize it as: is child marriage violence against children, and how are we going to address it? Dr. GESHINA?
Okay. Child marriage. Now, there's a difference, a debate looking at legislation, because in Malaysia it says 16 years in some states. Personally, my personal view is that yes, it's a form of violence against children because it should not happen. They may be biologically mature. For example, for the girls, they might have already their menses, but they are not mentally, psychologically prepared for the state of marriage. So we actually had done a study before regarding how children define marriage, what they view marriage is, and we find there's a clear difference between how children define marriage and adults define marriage. So there are differences from the aspect of the relationship in marriage, the responsibilities in marriage, what are their roles in marriage. And in many, many, many cases, child marriages end up in divorce.
Right.
Specifically,
we're out of time, so I'm sorry to cut you off. But I think you've made your point really well. Child marriage is a form of violence, and it leads to negative impact. And of course, the issue of rape is also present in child marriage. So I want to thank both our speakers, Kareeshini Priyadev, she's a child rights advocate, and Dr. GESHINA, she's a criminologist and psychologist at the University of Science, Malaysia. To our viewers out there, thank you so much for tuning in. Please like our Facebook page. It's CSO Platform for Reform. It's where you're watching it now, so go and like that page, please. This Thursday, we cover the same topic, stopping violence against children, in our Bahasa Malaysia talk show series. And next week, we resume again for our topic on women's rights. So thanks again, and see you next time.